I think everyone's here that's going to be here, so let's get this started. We have Jason Smith, who is the creator of Xamarin.Forms, as well as Eric Maupin, who is one of the devs on the Xamarin.Forms team. We have Mark Smith, who is works in Xamarin University. I think most of you guys know him, and myself, who heads up the education division over at Xamarin. So we've got, I think this will be kind of a fun conversation today. It's a little bit different than our usual guest lecture series, a little different than our usual program in the sense that this is more of a town hall. So this is going to be opened up to questions and conversation from you guys, the audience, and I'm going to kick it off with just a couple of things, a couple of questions that I have that I think are kind of important things to talk about, and then we'll go from there. So without further ado, first of all, Jason, I think that so 1.3, Xamarin.Forms version 1.3 is coming out soon, and it's really interesting. I've been looking at it, and I saw Charles Petzold's stuff, and I've been playing with some of the new styles and things like that. A couple of questions for you around that. First of all, when is that going to be shipping? And then also, what are the features that you think are most important, or the things that you're most excited about?
Yeah, so 1.3 will be shipping in, well, hopefully in about a week here for the final version. And that's going to really just depend on how long the pre-releases stay in the QA channel. We have quite a few really neat features coming out. If you don't already have the pre-release, you can grab it off the forums or off NuGet.org. I'm particularly excited about some of the new style work that's gone into 1.3. And these are things like the ability to set like title styles and label styles, and that is as in there. Also, we've included some things like new behaviors for the master detail page, the ability to modify the navigation backstack, and some improvements to things like the dependency service and layouts in general. And there's a lot of other incremental changes. You can find the full change logs on the forums. And honestly, it's kind of one of those things. There's just so much stuff in there. It's kind of hard to narrow it down a bit, which is why I kind of stumbled over the beginning of this. Also, I've got to get in the flow of things. Also, I want to make sure I mention, if you have questions, start asking them now. That way, when we start going through them, we can kind of find them rather than have to answer Brian's questions for the first 20 minutes.
Well, fair enough. I personally am super excited about the styles. I've been playing with them and setting application styles in my application zamel file and then using them all over the place, and it's been really, really cool. It's been a way easier way to style my application and make it unified across the entire across the entire app and change things in one spot. So that's very, very cool. Can you talk about the roadmap after 1.3? So 1.3 is going to come out sometime next week or the week after. What are the big things that are happening in the next 3 to 6 months after that?
Okay, so there's two kind of parts of the roadmap. There's the part of the roadmap where we say like, what are the releases coming out and what are they basically targeting, and then what are those features in those releases. So first, about what releases are coming out. We have the 1.3 pre-release 2 out right now. Pre-release 3 will be coming out very shortly. Is basically a couple last-minute bugs were found and we fixed them, and we don't want to have to wait a whole extra week just to have that one come out. So we're going to be pushing that very quickly. And then 1.3 final should come out in very short order. At the same time as 1.3 final coming out, there will be a pre-release of version 1.3.1. And the only difference between 1.3.0 and 1.3.1, besides a couple potential bug fixes here and there, will be 1.3.1 will support the 64-bit unified API that Xamarin is going to be releasing into the alpha channel.
Fantastic. So that actually leads me into my next question, which was, so Apple is going to require all new and updates to apps starting in early February to be 64-bit. Now, my understanding is that if you're playing with 1.3 today, you're already getting unified support if you want it. Is that 1.3.1 is that just an update to the final unified API?
So what's going to happen is because the final unified API ends up being not ABI or API compatible with the existing 64-bit API, we're not going to be releasing the 64-bit API with 1.3.0 because it's essentially targeting a version of the 64-bit API that's just not going to happen. So yes, it's there in the pre-releases. It will be pulled before the final release. Just basically pulled out of the NuGet package.
Got it. But will we be you're saying that 1.3.1 will be made available as a pre-release package immediately thereafter anyhow,
Immediately.
Right?
Yeah, exact same time. So if you need that 64-bit support, it will be available for you, the same day as 1.3.0.
Awesome. Great. And I think just because there's some confusion, how do we get the pre-release NuGet package today?
You can actually get it from NuGet.org. You just have to tell your IDE to include pre-release packages in its search, and you'll see the pre-releases pop up.
Fantastic. And for those of you who are in Xamarin Studio, it's just in the NuGet package manager. It's down in the bottom left corner. It's just a checkbox. I'm not sure where it's at in Visual Studio.
There's a combo box kind of at the top of the package manager.
Awesome. Super easy. Tell us about Windows RT support. When do you think that's coming?
I should, just to troll Eric, sign him up for an exact date here, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'll say,
don't you dare.
Sometime early next year, we'll have Windows RT support that is going to include Windows Phone 8.1, Windows RT tablets, and because we're supporting RT tablets, that will implicitly also mean RT desktop.
Fantastic.
And those are, in fact, kind of like they're Windows Universal, essentially, targets.
Yeah, great. That's what I was actually wondering. It's kind of a confusing story over there at Microsoft. Hopefully we'll see that simplify with the universal stuff. Marquise Howard has a question, which is, when do you guys think XamarinForms will support Android L?
1.3.0 will support Android L. It's become our primary testing device, or at least mine.
Got it. Very cool. Dan Vanderboom wants to know, what are the advantages of using XAML styles over a class of static resources referenced by x:static?
Hold on, where is this question? Because I'm not sure I understand.
Should be the top one in there.
I'm okay. What are the advantages of using XAML styles? Okay, XAML styles have a couple different advantages. One, they're easier to apply to large numbers of controls, so you can implicitly apply a style to all types of controls that are, children of the owner of the resource dictionary. This means, like, if you want all labels in a page to have a specific font, you can do that pretty easily, whereas if you're doing it with static resources, you have to apply it to every label. The other advantage is static resources don't update, but our styles actually can be updated, especially if you use them through dynamic resources, or you're referencing some of the pre-built styles that will automatically update with things like dynamic type on iOS.
Got it. That makes sense. Victor Hugo Garcia wants to know, what's the difference between XamarinForms Labs and XamarinForms? I got a little confused about it. I think actually a number of people have been running into this recently, so I think it's good to clarify.
Right. So in the early days, there were probably 8 to 10 different open source projects doing XamarinForms work, and we kind of went around to all of them, grabbed all the developers, and said, "Hey, you guys should all work together," which was great because they ended up making this thing called Xamarin.Forms Labs. It is a community project, and yes, the naming is a little confusing. The difference is that Xamarin.Forms Labs is not officially supported by Xamarin in terms of we don't develop it, so we don't ultimately control all the features and services they provide in there. However, they tend to produce pretty high quality stuff, so we do like their stuff quite a bit. And I've actually used it in some of my own personal projects. Xamarin.Forms Labs, though, however, the important distinction is it's a community project. And it's built on top of Xamarin.Forms.
Understood. Ivan Rodriguez asks, where will 1.31 put us in terms of getting close to reusing XAML, i.e. markup compatibility created for Silverlight or Windows RT? Is that even a goal? So I think the question there is, are we marching towards fidelity between Microsoft flavor of XAML as used in WPF and Silverlight with our own flavor of XAML?
There is no intention to make it so that you can just copy and paste XAML. We use XAML the language, not XAML the toolkit. And there is confusion around this. Like, Microsoft hasn't been super good at pointing out that XAML's a way of expressing a UI, but it's not specific to a particular toolkit. Xamarin.Forms essentially uses its own XAML namespace. And actually, Microsoft's projects, each like Silverlight versus WPF, all that stuff is its own namespace. Also, it's just they have a lot more crossover. And the reason for this is multiple. Some of the biggest and more obvious ones are things like XAML brushes, for example, are not easily emulated on all environments and wouldn't necessarily make sense. Windows toolkits, WPF, WinRT, and Silverlight are lookless toolkits. Essentially, they don't have a predefined style to them, so it's kind of constructed through that XAML. With things like Android and iOS, those are themed toolkits. They come with that theme, and you expect your controls to represent that theme. So having all that kind of lookless stuff into the XAML would be a bit detrimental and difficult at the very least.
Understood. I think to dive into that a little bit deeper, I know that one of the features that people have talked about quite extensively in terms of just sort of getting fidelity there has been the margin property. Do we have any plans to integrate that into the layout system the way that we have padding today?
Yeah, as the guy who's largely responsible for the layout system, I want margins. Margins are probably the most complicated thing to add to any particular layout system other than optimizations. So margins have always been on the roadmap. It's just been one of those things that once you have a content view with padding, you essentially have the ability to emulate margins as a user. It's just an annoying way to do it. And so it's never quite bubbled up to the point of being a important thing for a release, but it's now getting to that point where we're looking at it going, okay, margins have to happen. They're going to happen soon.
Got it. I think that makes sense. Lee Mallon, and I apologize in advance to anyone who I butchered their names, or anyone who has butchered their names already. So Lee has a question of when is swipe support coming in list views, and is it coming?
So there are more gesture recognizers in the pipeline. Some of those will be swipe and pan and that kind of stuff. However, when we get this question about swipe support and list views, this is usually because people want to implement SwipeToDelete. And what we've done in 1.3 is we've added this concept of context actions to cells, which are essentially little menu items you can add as metadata to a cell. And then that cell will now support the correct action to access that menu. On iOS, it will be swipe, and if you have a delete action in there, it will be more or less SwipeToDelete. So you'll swipe, there'll be a delete button, you can press it. It's pretty much what you expect. It's very similar to the Mail apps implementation of this.
So certainly that makes sense on iOS, but
Right.
I'm not sure that that's a metaphor on Android and
You're right. Use long
Windows
tap
Phone.
on Windows Phone and Android to get at the menu.
Got it. So would that swipe to delete or swipe functionality that you're talking about, would there be plans to make that platform specific in the sense that you could turn it on and you would get swipe to delete for iOS, but then long taps for Android and Windows Phone?
That's exactly how it works right now. If you attach context actions, it will pick the correct gesture to access those context actions.
Ah, very cool. Sounds like something that we need to get a recipe or some documentation around. Victor Hugo Garcia, I can't see the rest of your name because my screen, oh, Hernandez, has a question. So we have a vote system, which is, I believe he's referring to user voice, and that allows people to rank and assign votes to features that are that people want to see. And his question is, what is there a threshold for a number of votes to get a request into a feature? And specifically, he was looking for a placeholder text color feature, for example.
The placeholder text color feature is actually a really good feature idea, just because without it you can't do certain kind of designs. And for that reason, it's not really a matter of number of votes. Some things, no matter how many people vote for them, don't really match the particular long-term vision, or don't really make sense when you look at a longer-term roadmap, when you understand some of the other things that are coming down the pipe. So those things just won't get implemented in that way. But things like placeholder text color, that's actually one that we can actually take pretty easily, even if it has 1 or 2 votes, and pull it in. So unfortunately, it's not just a specific number of votes threshold. It's a once we see it and we recognize it as something we do or don't want, we'll pull it in.
Got it. So here's one for, I think, probably myself and Craig Dunn, which is, so Xamarin.Forms XAML controls are awesome, but Victor is a little frustrated with some of the documentation around the XAML controls themselves. And so his question is whether or not we'll be going deeper into documenting the XAML properties and other details within those controls. And I can answer that, Victor. The short answer is yes. There's been a bit of a limitation in the documentation, the API reference documentation system, in that it's very difficult to actually document XAML because there's basically no place for it in the current ECMA standard. And so what we've been doing is that we've been trying to work around it, and we will continue to do that in the future, and we will be adding more documentation around those XAML features because we know that it's incredibly important, and it's high priority for us. Steve Kellingbeck has a question about Cocoa Sharp support in Xamarin.Forms. Is that something that's on the roadmap? Is that something that makes sense? Is that something that we'll be
I'm more than
seeing?
happy to say that is something that makes sense. It's something that's on the roadmap. It is not something that is planned for the next release. And when I said actually, I mean the next feature release. There's bug fix releases in between feature releases, but it's not even planned for the next feature release. Though that's always kind of subject to change.
Got it. I can imagine that would be quite a heavy lift to get Cocoa Sharp into there.
I think the biggest lift is getting Cocoa Sharp PCLified properly so that we can use it. Yeah.
Got it. Anthony Harrison has a question. He says, because Xamarin.Forms essentially introduces Windows Phone and RT into the Xamarin Suite, and I think that's the RT, as we talked about, and universal support is in the future. Can we expect to see more components that support all three platforms? For example, I would like to see components such as Chromecast supporting iOS, Android, and Windows.
Yeah. The level of support component vendors provide is something we don't strictly control, though I do know they are beginning to encourage vendors to support all three platforms for this particular reason. And it also makes sense even if you're not using Forms, because you may still have a Windows Phone or a RT product and a shared backend code base. But we are pushing that more heavily. The new charting control components that are coming from people like Schema and Syncfusion are all three platforms, and hopefully we'll see more and more of that coming around. One of the biggest issues right now is the store packaging doesn't support the Windows targets, but anybody who's shipping through NuGet can do it today.
Got it. Dan Vanderboom has an interesting question, which is, any plans on the Xamarin.Forms roadmap to incorporate lightweight vector support beyond box view? And I think actually this is an interesting segue to talk about future system.drawing integrations as well.
Yeah, that's actually exactly how I was going to answer this. The answer is yes and no. I'll start with the no. Probably not the way you're expecting, in the sense of like having a bunch of vector commands you can just place into XAML and use them that way. That requires certain expectations of platforms that we can't always meet, and that actual argument gets pretty deep. But the reality is it's kind of hard to do it that way. What we can do across platforms with a high degree of reliability and consistency is provide you essentially a way to create an image source or an image, and keep in mind I'm not talking about a finalized API here, and create kind of a drawing context around that and draw into an image using the system.drawing library. That is possible, and hopefully will be available sometime before, middle of next year.
Got it. I'm certainly personally looking forward to that integration there. I think that's going to be huge, especially as especially with the fragmentation of screen sizes and whatnot. Now that Apple's got skin in the game there as well, I think fragmentation is something that now we're going to be looking at across the board. So system.drawing and vector reuse will certainly make some of that stuff easier. Lee Mallon asks if Forms will ever be open sourced, and I think I can answer that one. Lee, we don't have any plans currently for that, but it would be hard to say never. It's certainly a big part of our platform IP, and we consider it very close to our chest today. But who knows what the future brings? As you can see with Microsoft open sourcing quite a bit of their stack as well. I mean, who knows? Who knows what will happen there in the future?
Yeah, I'd like to tack on here and say, even though as a dev team we don't really decide if it gets open sourced or not, but what we do look at it and say, okay, why are people wanting open sourcing? And some of the people wanting open source is because there are some internal APIs that Xamarin.Forms has that are used to make that we use to communicate between the front end and the back end to do renderers and such. And this ends up limiting people's abilities to create their own platforms, and in some cases to actually override certain types of renderers. And this is not an intentional thing. We were not trying to create this limitation. It was just a fact of not having had time to go through all those APIs and review them. We are now going through a process of actually eliminating all those internal APIs, turning them all into public APIs, and making it so that the APIs we use to build Xamarin.Forms platforms are APIs that anybody has available to them. This will not be an immediate process. It'll be a gradual process that things will become more and more open to developers over the next, coming, 3-4 months.
That's great to hear. Victor Hugo Garcia Hernandez again, wondering if you are planning in future releases to centralize the resources, sorry about that, the centralized resources, mostly images used on a mobile app. So instead of having if defs for each platform, do you have a plan on making a way to put all of your image resources and other resources into a central place and then reuse them across the different platforms?
That's a difficult problem. There's a couple things you can do right now. Obviously, if you want to use the same image on all platforms, you can actually put that as an embedded resource on your PCL library. This isn't a particularly satisfying answer because most people don't want to, use the same image, and Retina support is a bit flaky when you do that. So the standard approach right now is you add an image per platform to each of the target projects, and you just name them the same, so you don't have to do any if-defing. However, it's not particularly fun to do it that way. We don't have a better answer yet, and I won't even say that we necessarily will in the short term.
Got it. Marquise Howard has a question. Will the Android player support push notifications, and when will there be additional phone choices? Actually, I think I'm going to skip that one because it doesn't have anything to do with Xamarin.Forms right now.
But I'll answer it and sign them up for things.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't. I don't want to speak for other teams on this particular webinar. Is more touch? So Dan Vanderboom, is more touch gesture support being added without having to go through custom renderers?
Yeah, there is the intention to add more gesture recognizers, particularly swipe and pinch.
Got it.
Those should be coming soon.
Circling back around to the list view, Lee Mallon wants to know if we will be adding support for reordering of rows.
You can already do that actually if you have a data-bound list view. So for example, if you use a observable collection as your data source, you can just go into your observable collection and reorder the rows, and that reordering will propagate back up to the actual.
He might be asking about the ability for the user to do it, though.
Yeah, from a touch event, I think is the question.
Yeah, and he just put that in there. Yeah.
And in that case, no, that's not in there yet. And in fact, I don't believe it's on the immediate roadmap yet either.
Actually, it's there's a whole set of the ability for the user to manipulate the list. There's a whole set of features that goes with that, especially with context actions is the first step in that, but we know there's a lot more to that, so yeah. I can't say when, but we're definitely thinking about it.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah, those seem like probably some important features to be thinking about. Yep. Jesse Liberty, our local celebrity here, on the says, is there a sample for SwipeToDelete on iOS?
If there is not a context action sample, there will be one. I will work with the docs team to make sure that gets done. I can always bother Craig.
Sounds good. Craig's actually on the call here.
Yeah, so, I heard that.
Cool. Tom Walker wants to know if there's a plan to get zamel IntelliSense or autocomplete for Visual Studio, because if you do XAML today in Xamarin Studio, you'll see that we actually have autocomplete for that.
So there's actually some really great news in this area. I can't speak to vanilla Visual Studio because that is actually in progress and being worked on by our Visual Studio team, our wonderful Visual Studio team. I don't want to give them a deadline or a timeline on that because it is very difficult, apparently. However, if you need it today, JetBrains ReSharper fully supports Xamarin.Forms XAML. You get full IntelliSense everything, and it's absolutely fantastic. I use it, so yeah, I'm totally promoting another company's product right now, but
Very cool. Well, they're a partner, so I think that's all right. And they make fantastic products. So Philip Ochu wants to know, will there be support for toolbar items displayed in a bottom toolbar? And perhaps that would mean a tertiary toolbar or properties indicating where you'd want some toolbars to be displayed.
So the irony of this was, and there actually still is in the Xamarin.Forms codebase, a toolbar class, which is a toolbar view. Not that different from, it's exactly what you expect it to be. It's a horizontal toolbar. It just, the API for it never got polished and finished, and it keeps kind of falling down on the priority list because, there's this other global toolbar support. That said, it's starting to kind of populate back up with the next release, focusing more and more on adding missing controls. This is a natural place to add it.
Got it. Dan Vanderboom wants to know if the Xamarin.Forms team actively engages with component vendors and open source groups to fill in some of the gaps as the platform grows.
Actually,
and I think I can speak to some of that, Dan. That actually happens sort of across the org. Our business development unit drives a lot of those conversations today. So if you have ideas of things that you'd like to see, certainly throw them at user voice, or tweet at us or contact us in any of the myriad of ways. And the more that we hear from customers, then about feature requests and things like that, then the more that we have an understanding of what's important, and we can drive those conversations with our partners.
One other thing, I want to come back to the IntelliSense thing. Apparently, I'm getting pinged by people now saying there is a thing, there's a website here. I've posted into the chat, which I don't know if people can see, but it's it's a website, cuzzolino.com/mobile essentials, which Daniel Cuzzolino is one of our developers, and you can install IntelliSense support for Visual Studio apparently right now.
Fantastic. And that's Keizu for those that may know him. So Mike wants to know if there are any plans on the roadmap to support skins for Xamarin.Forms, and this is, I think, probably an interesting question, especially in relation to the 1.3 release coming up with styles and whatnot. It certainly makes that a lot easier.
So that question really depends on your definition of skins, because if you want like full visual capacity to change anything, then you will always end up in a situation where you need some platform-specific stuff. So there's essentially two methodologies of skinning an app. The first is you do it within Xamarin.Forms, and you will just apply your skins by creating styles that define all the properties we support, so background colors, images, that kind of stuff.
I'm sure there's an obvious joke here about the many ways to skin an app.
So you can apply the skins that way, and obviously this is a far more limited skinning capacity. And then if you need the more complicated platform-specific skinning, you should be able to still go into the platform-specific code and add those skins in that way. And of course, now you're doing it in platform-specific code and not cross-platform code. I know that's not a particularly satisfying answer for somebody who wants cross-platform skinning, but that's kind of that's going to be kind of the state where we can't, we're not going to provide like the ability to fully customize the render of everything without any platform-specific code.
Got it. Adam Zuki, I'm sure I've said that wrong. It's probably Zucchi. So he wants to know, are there any planned enhancements to the Webview in Xamarin.Forms to allow two-way communication, so between C# and the Webview, the way that we've done with the hybrid app samples that Joseph Hill has created?
Yeah, so currently there is an eval method which returns void, which some people find very, very annoying. And the biggest issue with this is not all platforms necessarily support returning the result of an eval call. So we're kind of in this situation where we need to figure out what we want to do about that. Do we add an eval method that has a return that doesn't necessarily work on all platforms, or do we say this is a limitation because we can't make it work everywhere? And we just haven't made that call yet. And just because it doesn't work everywhere isn't a deal breaker for us. Sometimes we say, well, this is a silly limitation of this platform, so we'll document that limitation and support it everywhere we can.
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense. Until those underlying platform restrictions are lifted, then there's only so much we can do. Darren Cole wants to know if there are plans for a visual designer for Xamarin.Forms.
We've been kind of flaky on answering this one in the past. However, we did start answering it a little bit at Evolve, and I'll go ahead and give the same answer I gave there, which is yes, but with limitations. It is not. We will try to support in multiple stages. Essentially, initially you'll get like a live preview mode where you type out some XAML or some code, and we'll live preview that page to you, probably initially in something that looks like a sketch of an app, not so much an actual rendering on a particular platform. And then in a further stage, we'll probably try to support where the live preview is actually all three different, or however many different target platforms we have at that time, all those target platforms being visible at the same time so that you can see it live on each platform as you go. And then a final step would be to then add drag and drop support so that you can drag and drop different elements onto the screen and do that kind of stuff. So there is kind of like a plan, and like each of those steps gets progressively harder, which means they take progressively longer. But certainly we want to get like a live preview thing. Essentially, think Sketches but better for forms, at least. Sketches is great for other things, but we want something like Sketches that's targeted at forms in particular for doing this kind of thing. That should come hopefully not too far into the future, because it's obviously a very common request.
Very cool. I think that even starting out with just the preview, sort of prototype preview, would be a huge step forward, and certainly help people to design their XAML faster. Lee Mallon wants to know if there's any plans to support the width and height binding once the layout has been rendered. So this is not at design time, but rather at runtime after it's already been shown on the screen.
You want to bind. I'm sorry. Actually, there's not quite as much detail as I think I need to fully understand exactly what you want to do there. Can you?
I think he wants to bind. So he wants to bind to an element's widths, like width and height, without adding a custom renderer, so that he can dynamically resize the box view.
You probably do. We just added the ability to bind width request and height request, which are probably what you want to bind instead. Assigning to those will tell the layout system that you want to change your actual sizing. Width and height are more of the actual rendered size and not the request size that you'll give to the layout system.
Got it. I think that it might be worth it to kind of explain or give a quick overview of how that works and why those things are different, because I think that a lot of people are actually confused about the difference between a request and the actual rendered size.
Sure. So when you talk about a layout system, you have to have this way of dealing with the fact that there's not always enough space on screen to give everything the size it needs to be. Oh, if you meant width and height requests, yeah, those are bindable now in 1.3. Sorry, Lee just updated his comment saying he meant width and height request.
Got it.
Yes, those are bindable now.
And I've used them, Lee, so I can confirm that they're bindable since that was actually my request.
They're two-way bound.
Yeah, they are two-way. This is an interesting question from Dan Vanderboom, which is, how did the Xamarin.Forms project start? How long was it in the making? And was there much pushback to overcome trying to create a unified UI framework across the platforms?
Oh man, Jason, you finally get to tell your story.
And I can, by the way, I have a sort of anecdotal partial answer to this, which is, I remember we were at our old office in San Francisco, or our last office, not the office before, and I remember coming by Jason's desk, and he was so excited because he wanted to show me this thing, and he'd been, he's like, it's one of those times in which you see that a developer has a eureka moment, right? It's one of those times in which, developers get probably, a few times in their life, and so he's so excited to show me, and so I come over, and he says, "Look at this," and he shows me a box. He's like, "Look at this box. I'm rendering this box on the iOS." Like, that's fantastic, Jason. That's really great. I'm gonna go over here now. and in truth, it was actually a fantastic moment because the box was rendering with a single code base across, I think it was 2 platforms at that time. I don't know.
Android and iOS were the original targets.
Yeah, didn't originally support Windows Phone. So it was actually really cool. And then, of course, the box became a button, and then the button became many other things. And it all started out with that simple canvas view in a box, which I thought was really funny.
Yeah, and when we did this kind of, it actually came from a lot of people's different ideas. I had been developing this animation system that ended up working as a cross-platform base for a toolkit. It was a complete fluke that it kind of ended up. The original version of Xamarin.Forms, and when I say original version, I don't think any of this code really exists that much anymore, had like a full physics engine in it, and and it was really designed more as like a canvas drawing API. And then we started putting actual controls into it and realized, wait, we actually have something kind of going on here. And we pulled in some work from a guy by the name of James Clancy, and that added in the list view and table view work that he was already doing to make those cross-platform. And we brought in Eric Maupin, and he started, talking about this mystical, wonderful thing called MVVM. And everybody thought he was crazy for a little while, but he ended up having some really great ideas in that area, and that eventually led to us having this wonderful bindable toolkit that we have today. There wasn't a lot of pushback, actually. Once we started demoing it, people were like, all right, great, go do it. The biggest pushback was, like, how do we figure out that we make sure that we're not being confusing about what this is? And that's something we're probably still figuring out a little bit. Like, how do we make sure that somebody who really maybe shouldn't be using forms, because there are people who shouldn't be using forms, don't end up using it by mistake? There's still a case for using platform.
And I think I can add to this as well. It was interesting because from an executive perspective, we've been talking about doing something like this for a long time. There's some other platforms out there that do interesting things, but they do them in a really non-performant and non-native way. And so we obviously saw the need and the value of doing cross-platform UI toolkits to extend code sharing really all the way through the UI in a way that wasn't possible with just the current MVVM toolkits and things like that, but to really make a UI layer that rendered natively and performantly. So it was definitely something that we were talking about, we were pushing, and when we saw the work that was being done, it made sense to sort of unify those things. And then as it gained steam, I mean, it was kind of like it snowballed in a quick way. And as it gained steam, it made a lot of sense to keep throwing resources at it. In terms of the positioning and pushback, we never really pushed back on it, but as Jason said, one of the things that we've struggled with is the positioning of Xamarin.Forms. In many ways, Xamarin.Forms 1.0 is a lot like the .NET 1.0 release, and so it's it's not a beta product at all. It's certainly a 1.0 product, but all 1.0 products, I think, have their limitations, and it's not for all applications. And so one of the things that we've been sort of struggling with lately is how to position something that's so incredibly powerful and has so much potential and promise, and make sure that people aren't jumping onto it prematurely, because it is, I mean, there's really nothing else like it in the industry. There's nothing else like it in technology today. Even similar frameworks are pretty far behind. You could look at things like Qt and whatnot. It's still, those things are fundamentally different and limited in ways that Xamarin.Forms isn't. But with that said, Xamarin.Forms is largely useful as a starting point for prototyping applications, and then and there's a number of application types and designs that make a lot of sense to be built in Xamarin.Forms, but there are certainly limitations today that you might hit with specific use cases and specific UX designs and whatnot. So that's something that we've sort of struggled with in branding and messaging, because it is so powerful and everyone really wants to use it, but there are still some edge cases where things don't make sense, which actually segues into something that I think that it's important to talk about, which is how to make performant list views, because I think today one of the biggest pain points for folks is that when they have lots and lots and lots of layouts on the screen, which is easily attainable in a list view, because obviously it's an opportunity for lots of things to be thrown on the screen at once, and in some case thousands of primary layouts, which may contain many layouts within them for each cell. You have some performance tips and some suggestions, I think, in making those things performant. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So first off, Eric stepped away, but he would kill me if I didn't.
Perfect timing.
Yeah, he would kill me if I didn't mention this. The performance issues a lot of people encounter with list view have to do with the contents of the cells and not the actual list view. And the reason the contents of the cells are so important is the way that they get reused strongly impacts the scrolling performance of a list view. So as you scroll, what happens is the cells get reused. So when a cell goes off screen, the list view will grab that cell, stick it at the bottom of the screen where it's about to pop up, and change the data. That's how everybody implements list views, whether they do it explicitly or implicitly, in their toolkit, is up to them. But the important thing is that happens. But because that's what's happening, you often have to do a relayout of what's inside the list view. This can incur severe performance penalties depending on how complicated that layout is and how complicated it is to apply that new data. So your tips and tricks are basically this. For maximum performance and if you particularly don't care about getting everything to look pixel identical to whatever you want it to look like, you just need data on screen, use the pre-built cells, use a text cell, use a switch cell. Those kinds of cells are extremely optimized for this kind of case. They reuse extremely quickly, and they're basically optimal performance of that area. You can just throw them on there and scroll as fast as you want; they'll be fine. If you need the ability to customize the layouts and everything, and you're not particularly worried about performance, you need it to be fast but not potentially 60 frames per second when you're scrolling at 1,000 cells a second or something like that. You should use a view cell, and view cells are the most expensive way to do this because they go through the whole Xamarin.Forms layout cycle. And this is how most people are doing it, and this is why a lot of people are ending up seeing performance issues because they are going through that layout cycle. So if you need something in between the two, where you need the performance and you need the completely custom look, which a lot of people need, you can make a custom cell renderer. This does mean you're writing some platform-specific code for this particular cell type, but you can go in and now optimize the whole layout cycle yourself to just be exactly what you need it to be. You don't have this general layout system on top of it, which we have to do when we do view cells. And
is that what you're doing with the optimized, the default cells,
yes,
so the text?
Those are just custom cell renderers, is all they are, which is what makes them so fast. And I'm sure if we don't have an example in the documentation, we can get one. And then the last thing you can do is if you already have a list view built in the platform-specific code, just bind that thing in as or bring that thing in as a custom renderer, and away you go. You don't necessarily have to use our list views to get data on screen. It's just nice and convenient and easy. So there's kind of like 2-3 steps you can take to improve your list view performance. And all that said, the reason view cells are slow at times is because it's a new layout system, and so it takes time to optimize those. We're still finding plenty of cases where we're going, oh, this can be made faster, that can be made faster. And as we do that, view cells are getting faster. But they're not there yet.
Makes sense. I think that's a great answer, and I can attest to that as well. As we sat in screen sharing the other day, looking at some places where optimizations were actually fairly easy. There's some low-hanging fruit there, so I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, I think that it's worth noting that it is a V1.0 product. And to that effect, I just want to say Dan says it's been fantastic for a V1 product, and I agree. And I think that the whole team deserves kudos for that one. Lee Mallon has a question here. Are there any plans or best practices for supporting multi-screen sizes aside, in particular iPhone 6 Plus, and of course the fragmentation of Android and the phablets and whatnot? So we're in sort of a different world today, in that the fragmentation of screen sizes exists across all platforms now. So do we have any plans to make that easier, and what are the current best practices?
So there are two things worth noting. One is that because we're not in a situation where you tend to find layouts in like a strictly like this goes at X position 10, Y position 30, it's 100 by 200 pixels. You define things using adaptive layouts. You use stack layouts, you use grids. You don't always need to be able to distinguish between, different screen sizes, but that doesn't mean you don't want to. We are starting to discuss different ways you can provide, for example, multiple XAML files for the same screen and have some kind of predicate that selects the correct one for the correct device. I think it's
also important to point out that you can actually do this today as well. One of the things here is that the UX experience between a phone-sized device and a tablet-sized device generally should be considered as a separate exercise in UX, in the sense that a tablet might be able to hold 3 times as much functionality on screen as a phone, and so oftentimes that means more than just resizing of elements. And so if you want to do that today, you can define multiple XAML files for different for different layouts. And what you do is that you put your core page functionality into a base class, and then you can subclass that for a tablet version or a large form factor, and then the phone version. And that's a common and supported pattern today.
Yeah, and I'm sure we can find documentation on doing that somewhere. The important thing is, or not the important thing. So what I wanted to make sure was clear is that we do recognize that this is a desire that we want to provide a really convenient way for doing this. And it's still in the planning stages because there's so many different devices. Xamarin.Forms really, because it targets it's not just targeting Android and all its fragmentation, it's targeting Android's fragmentation, iOS fragmentation, and Windows fragmentation, and all that's kind of together. You need a much more powerful system than what any of those three actually provide. And so we're working on designing something along a predicate selector system.
Very cool. I know that I'm just destroying the pronunciation here. Tirachai Lauthong has a question, which is a bit of a deep dive here. What's the most appropriate method to place my binding wire-up code between my views and view models, and also to register event handlers? And please consider the lifecycle and navigation back and forth. For example, if you re-register the event handler twice, your handler will get called twice.
Most appropriate method to place my binding wire-up code between my. We actually, so when you're particularly talking about like where do I call set binding, which I believe is the crux of the question for the most part, you can actually do that right in your constructor, which is nice because you don't have to worry about any view cycle for that particular view. Or not view cycle, life cycle for that particular view. Xamarin.Forms is kind of designed with the idea that from the point of construction, most of the properties, basically the view is functional. You don't have to wait for any kind of lifecycle event to come along and tell you, okay, now you can wire it up. It should just be doable right in the constructor, because this has a lot of niceties and parallels with how things work in .NET. I think that answers the majority of the question.
Certainly, if there's any follow-up on T-Rich, go ahead and continue to ask, and we can dive deeper.
Yeah.
Another question here is from Dan Vanderboom. Are there any plans to make the controls more composable? The button, for example, holds a single label instead of any arbitrary content, which was a major benefit of Microsoft's XAML controls. And I think that's a good point. And in Microsoft XAML, the point that Dan is making is that you could create a button, you open a button tag, and you could basically put anything in there. And so the question is do we have plans to follow that pattern?
Certainly not for the default button class, and there's a very strong reason for that, which is it's not exactly a pattern or paradigm supported on all of our intended target platforms. Sometimes we have to look and say, okay, is this going to be a control or is it going to be a composable view? And when we look at something like button or label or that kind of thing, we have to look and go, okay, this is a control because it's kind of an atomic element on these platforms where it doesn't make sense to do that. So when we
I think it's important to point out that certain metaphors like that just simply don't exist in the mobile world today.
Yeah, and XAML is incredibly powerful, and we love it. And we don't want to sit there and knock what they've done. It's just it doesn't quite map perfectly.
And so Tirachai has another question, which is how do I set the entry to have the next search or done button on the keyboard? And I think that's probably primarily an iOS question, but I know that even on the other platforms there are similar settings.
Yeah. Currently, you can't control that. What you can control is you can set one of the keyboard types to the keyboard. If you want to go ahead and actually submit a bug report on the bug tracker, that's actually something that's a really good feature request and probably should be done.
Yeah, I would love to see that. It's also worth it to point out that today you could use a custom renderer to do that as well.
Yes.
Dan actually wants to point out a compliment that says, after going through the iOS and Android classes, implementing cell recycling, manually. The way that you have to do it if you're writing non-Xamarin.Forms code, the fact that we do that and handle that seamlessly under the hood for Xamarin.Forms is awesome. So I think that's about it for questions. Looks like the rest of these are actually just compliments telling us that. We have one more, and then we'll wrap this up because I think we're going to go over time. Lee says, "Is there any way I can force Xamarin Form elements to redraw? As in, sometimes the UI doesn't update to binding, particularly on lower Android devices or when values are changed quickly."
Honestly, if that's ever happening, I would love a reproduction or a bug report, especially if it's like it only happens on this kind of, less powerful device. It just frankly shouldn't happen. That said, calling forced layout on the parent of the control will cause that layout to basically relay out all of its children, which triggers a draw. That's a very heavy-handed thing to do, though, so I wouldn't recommend like peppering that all over your code.
Fantastic. Well, I think that it's time to wrap this up. But once again, I'd like to thank Jason Smith and Eric Maupin and Craig Dunn, and of course Mark Smith, for coming out today and answering questions. It's not very often, I think, that you get to talk to someone directly who created a particular platform's tool sets. So I think it's very cool that we have this opportunity, and really awesome that we get to talk to Jason directly. So once again, thank you very much. And I hope that everyone can tune in on January 7th. We're actually wrapping it up for the holiday season for the guest lecture series. But on January 7th, James Clancy will be doing a guest lecture on memory and performance, and I think that one's going to prove to be really, really cool. James Clancy has a ton of expertise around this. He's actually our hired gun that we send out to folks, to partners and customers when they're running into performance issues, and we send him out, and inevitably every single time he comes back with happy customers. So getting a chance to see some of his tips and tricks and then pick his brain will be very, very cool. So again, thanks for everyone who tuned in and joined us today. Remember, this will be recorded for posterity. So if you want to revisit it, feel free to go to the guest lectures page and watch it anytime you want. It should be up within a couple of days. And then also the Xamarin.Forms team is very, very active in the forums up on Xamarin, which is forums.xamarin.com, and then one of the forums there is Xamarin.Forms. So go in there and ask those guys questions anytime you want. So again, thanks everyone for joining, and we're going to sign out.
All right. Thank you.